Thank you, Tim. And I knew Tim in Boston when he helped start a newspaper there called Spare Change that still exists and was the model for real change here in Seattle. So I knew him from 15, 20 years ago when I worked on affordable housing issues. So thank you for bringing me out for Real Change, which is a truly transformative organization in terms of the work that it does. And also to Pastor Lang and for hosting this coffee house. And it's just I live in a neighborhood of Boston, Jamaica Plain, and we about 3 years ago started something called the Jamaica Plain Forum. And I was looking at your list of speakers and saying, oh, we've had some of those speakers too. So I think there's something about the face-to-face Chautauqua tradition, the lyceums, the people getting together to talk about the great issues of the day that you just don't, I think is key to a healthy democratic society. So thank you for coming out and missing whatever was on TV tonight to be with your neighbors, to have this conversation. And I want to lift up, I saw that on October 11th, David Corton and Marjorie Kelly are speaking here. And all the two of them and myself, we all are part of an effort called the New Economy Working Group, which is to sort of say, look, as Richard Lang said, we're in a transition. We're in an ecological and economic transition. The next 10 years ain't going to look anything like the last 30 years. And how do we prepare ourselves personally and our communities and our nation and our world for these transitions? What is it going to look like? And so this book, 99 to 1, is actually part of a series that David Corton and Marjorie Kelly we've all written books this year, published by Barrett Kohler, on this whole transition to a new economy. So I lift that up and invite you to come back and hear, particularly Marjorie, who is from Boston, so she doesn't come out that often, as talks about the cooperative economy. But let me start by just saying that some of you probably, when you saw the title of the book, 99 to 1, we're probably thinking, oh, so this is another kind of book that's about, the crimes of the 1%, and it's sort of an attack on the 1%, however people think about that, and which I've heard a lot. And I kind of want to start off by just saying biographically, I grew up in the 1%. My great-grandfather was the meat packer Oscar Mayer, who started a business in Chicago 100 years ago, 120 years ago now. And so my father used to say, bringing home the bacon has a different meaning in our family, which is very, very true. I also went to a very kind of elite private prep school in Bloomfield Hills, Michigan, outside Detroit. And it was one of these schools that was modeled after the old British tradition. We had headmasters and forms and prefects and all of that. And one of my classmates was a guy named Mitt Romney. You've probably heard about him. And he was several years older than me. And I could tell you some other stories about sort of the environment at Cranbrook and bullying and those sort of things. But he and I basically both grew up in this sort of same community, same imprint, kind of in the 1%, steeped in the sort of beliefs about how we're more deserving and worthy. And there was a lot about our schooling, which was about preparing us to lead. In fact, the school motto was aim high. And it was depicted by a logo of an archer shooting an arrow straight into the air, which, if you think about it, is a really foolish thing to do. So I like to think that, but you can, as you can tell, candidate Romney is aiming high and perhaps shooting the arrow straight into the air, so hopefully we'll. So the context, though, is that this discussion about the topic of the book, the extreme inequality of wealth, has really taken a leap forward. Thanks to the events a year ago, the Occupy movement, and other movements that I think sort of streams of education and organizing efforts, the conversation about inequality took a huge leap forward. And one of the things that I was struck by a year ago, there was a Tumblr site where people called We Are the 99%, where people posted their picture with a statement. Any of you ever looked at that or seen that? A number of you have seen it. It's still there. And they're stories. It's basically people's stories. And some of the memorable stories I remember, a young woman who says, you know, I used to dream about being the first woman president. Now I dream about having a job with health insurance. And a young man said, or another woman said, I'm working bussing tables for $8 an hour so I can help my father pay off $23,000 in medical debt. I hope to get married. I'm saving up money, but it looks to me like my entire future will be ruled by debt. So I'm 22 years old, and all I can see down the line is paying interest. She says, I am the 99%. And another fellow wrote in and said, you know, I served a tour of duty in Iraq, where I worked to help politically connected private contractors make a lot of money. I came back to the United States after an economic meltdown where the greed of bankers and excess destroyed our economy. And he said, I've joined the Occupy efforts. You know, this is the second time I've been fighting for my country, but now the first time I understood who my enemy is. And on and on. And I encourage you to go on and read these stories, because I could tell you statistics about inequality that you probably are as rooted in as I am. The fact that, you know, 1% of the population now has more wealth than the bottom 95%. That the share of wealth over the last 30 years going to the 1%, and the share of national income continues to grow. But these stories actually, I think, break through. And when I read them, I realize there are stories of people who are trapped in poverty, who are surviving, trying to survive, don't see any way forward. There are stories of what I would call the collapsing middle class experience, people who, you know, were pursuing the American dream and then had the rug pulled out from under them, their hope to retire, to hold on to a home and pay off a mortgage, to have a chance to have leisure in their older years and travel or enjoy their grandchildren. Their dreams have been wrecked by foreclosure and unemployment and the changing economy. And then there's a group of young people who are part of those stories who have followed the advice of their elders, and some of them have gone to college and they've taken on tens of thousands of dollars in debt and have absolutely no concept or idea of how they're going to pay off that debt and feel completely betrayed. And when you read those stories, you realize, yes, we may have political events and presidential elections will come and go, but that those underlying conditions, people trapped in poverty, the collapsing middle class, young people with no way forward, those underlying conditions are not going away. In fact, our current political system, captured as it is by a couple thousand global corporations and segments of the 1%, our current political system is incapable of actually addressing those problems. And so that's why the pressure will continue to build in different forms. The Occupy movement was one expression of that. There are other streams of these movements flowing that will continue to pop up. We might get distracted or deflected into various things, but the underlying grievances are not going away. And so I believe the pressure will continue to build in various ways, and that ultimately there will be some pressure and some realignment politically and socially that will force some kinds of change. But I want to talk to you about that. And a couple of just things I want to say, though, that I've worked on these issues of inequality of wealth for about 25 years. About 15 years ago, when we started United for a Fair Economy, there was still a debate over whether these statistics about inequality were accurate, meaning there was a contested debate over, are we becoming more unequal? And you had, some people arguing, no, these inequalities, this is just, if you look at the data this way, we're not unequal. And there is no contest now in the realm of rational data discussion. You can read about income inequality and wealth disparities in the Wall Street Journal. You can see it in very independent research. There's a recognition that we have entered into a new phase of extreme inequality of both income and wealth. Where there's still a little bit of contest politically is, do these inequalities matter? So some people still argue poverty is a problem, but we should not really be concerned about how concentrations of wealth, how rich the rich are. That's not really, let's look at the problems over here. Let's look at, and even within a lot of faith communities and religious congregations, the debate is divided. Let's talk about what we can all agree on here, which is the poverty is a problem. And we as Christians or people of faith, whatever your tradition is, should address the issues of poverty. But let's not talk about how much wealth is gushing up to the top. That's a little divisive. That's class warfare. That's envy. So there's still a little bit of debate about that. But what I want to say is that now, after about several decades, there is now incredible evidence in every discipline that these disparities of income and wealth are trashing everything we care about. So if you care about, think about what is it that moves you, that you care about? Think about children and their opportunities, grandchildren. You care about the health of the ecological environment. You care about the city that you live in and the quality of life and transportation and what are people's lives in a city. You care about democracy and whether we have real participation. You care about mobility, the American dream that if you work hard, maybe you can actually climb the economic ladder. You care about the stability of the economy. You care about sports. Whatever you care about, I can show you now the evidence that these extreme inequalities are trashing each of these areas. That, for instance, if you care about your health, if you care about the health of your body and your community, then these inequalities are destroying the social fabric. People here at the University of Washington have the privilege of having Dr. Stephen Bezruka here, who has done some of the most important research in the planet on these issues. And across in England, Richard Wilkinson and Kate Pickett wrote this book called Spirit Level, how equal societies do better on every indicator. Inequality is making us sick. You're better off living in a society with a lower median income but more equality than a society with higher income but greater disparities of income and wealth. Because, and here's the important underlying reason, when you have extreme inequalities of wealth, when a society pulls apart to that level, the rich and poor gap, there is a breakdown that happens. A breakdown in solidarity, that sense that we're all in the same boat, a breakdown in empathy, an injury to you, does it still matter to me? There's a breakdown in order and continuity and community, and people become polarized, and in place of that, they become fearful, or they begin to believe caricatures about the other. And again, this is why an organization like Real Change is so important, because 1,000 times a day, the vendors who sell you spare change are reaching across economic and racial divides to say, here I am, I'm a human being, I want to connect with you and at least want to sell you a terrific newspaper. That's revolutionary in a society where people live in different class and race bubbles. And the more polarized, the more those bubbles exist. So inequality matters. I won't even go down the list of every way it matters. You could have an interdisciplinary department at the University of Washington now on inequality studies that would bring together biologists, psychologists, doctors, political scientists that would sort of can document why these inequalities matter. So I won't go on and on. But it does undercut what we care about. A second point I want to make is that 99-1 as a framework has really obvious limitations. Not everybody in the 99 has comparable experiences, right? I mean, it's obvious. If you're in the 95th percentile, your experience of, and you have savings and a second home is very different than somebody who's in the bottom 5th or the bottom 10% or is destitute. Similarly, if you're a person of color in the 99%, your experience of trying to build assets, save, build businesses is entirely different. So that 99-to-1 frame shouldn't be kind of an excuse to lump together or render invisible the experience of poverty or the racial wealth divide, which is so persistent. But it is a kind of an interesting framework, I think, to understand what's going on. For instance, we have had an economy. The rules of the economy have been changed to benefit the 1% at the expense of the 99%. Sure, if you're in the top 5th, you've benefited from some of those rule changes. But it's a very important analytical point. The rules of the economy have been tilted to benefit a very small group. What do we want? We want an economy that works for everybody. And I think that 99-to-1 lens, if people look through that, who see that their interests, they actually have common cause with a large majority of people, is a powerful thing. Actually, on Monday, the Institute for Policy Studies, where I work, we're releasing an inequality voter scoring card, where we look at 38 pieces of legislation with the simple lens of, did this legislation benefit the 1%, or was it good for the 99%? And we have a bipartisan list of voters and elected officials and what their records are in relation to these inequality issues. So it's like an inequality sports card. Is that my phone ringing? No. God is calling. We'll take a break here. So it's a useful framework. That said, the 1%, it doesn't make sense to lump together the 99%, nor does it necessarily make sense to lump together, in my opinion, the 1%. Having grown up in the 1%, I actually have had a front row seat to the fact that there are a huge percentage of people in that 1% actually have devoted themselves, are concerned about having a fair economy, having a society that works for everybody. So there's this segment of allies and people who have worked philanthropically behind the scenes, many of them quite humbly, to work for a good society. The problem is, within the 1%, there's a segment that I characterize as the rule riggers, the game fixers. They use their considerable wealth and power to influence the political system, to change the rules, to benefit themselves so that more wealth and power funnels to the top. And that is a hyper-organized segment in the 1%. And they have a whole mythology that they subscribe to, which is kind of like this Ayn Rand view of the world, which is there are the virtuous prime movers. There are those of us who, are the engines of the economic train that pull the rest of the train along. And we are the virtuous ones. And we should, be free of government regulation and even taxation, and we should all just bow down and exalt their efforts. So they believe that it's really in the best interests of the whole economy to just have policies that benefit themselves more and more. You think of the Koch brothers, who are these two brothers who have this huge, who are today. The Forbes 400 released their list of their annual sort of September once-a-year tally of the billionaires. The Koch brothers, their net worth from last year increased 24%, from $50 billion to $62 billion. That's $12 billion more than they had last year. So their strategy is working. It's a very good investment. You invest $100 million in changing the political system, and your net worth, you can't do better in the market, right? I mean, so they are rule riggers. We should not think of that. We should understand that's their wealth building strategies, to tip the rules, tip the game in their favor. And those are the folks that we should understandably focus on in terms of taking back our democracy, taking back our economy, and addressing that. The other point that I try to make in this book, having worked with business leaders like Bill Gates, we organized 3,500 multimillionaires and billionaires to publicly preserve the inheritance tax or the estate tax. And it was a really powerful campaign. And one of the things I learned in that is that there are two types of businesses, at least, but if I could be, kind of group them together, there's the majority of businesses in this country are what the journalist Jim Collins calls built-to-last businesses. They're anchored in a locality. They are accountable to a community. This is not always the case, but they're more rooted. They pay taxes in a locality. They are philanthropically engaged in a community. But there's this small segment, a couple thousand global corporations that operate across state lines and across international borders. And their entire business model is what I would call built to loot. So there's built to last and built to loot. And they will tell you that they're job creators. But in fact, their business model is about shedding jobs, is about getting you to pay their bills. So many of these companies have figured out how to game the system, so they have subsidiaries around the world and they move their profits around and they pay very little or low taxes in the United States so that you and I pick up the slack. And they try to shift jobs and they try to squeeze their employees and they try to get our communities to pay the healthcare costs of their employees, and they dump their pollutants into the stream and we have to pick it up. So their model is to shift costs off of their balance sheet onto you and me and onto nature, and that's their way that they boost their profits and boost their net worth. And I think going forward, it's important to realize there's huge allies in the business community in that built to last, rooted business effort. And that's where some of these business associations like the Business Alliance for Local Living Economies, or some, here, Washington First, Seattle First, these are the rooted businesses that we should be lifting up, and we should be trying to de-link as much as possible from the built-to-loot economy and the built-to-loot corporations. So that's a little bit of context, but I think what you're probably wondering is sort of what's the way forward? How do we reverse these inequalities, and is it too late? Right? Have we crossed some lines? Have we become so deeply rutted in these patterns of inequality? And I think we have some huge challenges in that. But I think that there are some interesting rumblings out there that I just want to observe. And then we'll take a break and hear your questions, write your questions, and hear some music, and then come back and discuss what are our prospects. But one thing is that most European countries, Canada and the European social democracies, have much lower levels of inequality than we in the United States have. Now, why is that? Well, one reason is they have a higher floor, meaning there's higher income floor, there's a floor through which people cannot fall into complete destitution and poverty. Can't fall through the healthcare floor. There's minimum standards of health, income, access to opportunity. And so many societies are not as extremely unequal as the United States because they do things like raise the minimum wage, or have universal health insurance, or have established paid vacation time, or benefits that raise the floor high. So there are things that we can do that just raise the floor to create at least minimal standards of dignity and opportunity. So there's a set of policies there. There's also a set of public policies or interventions that reduce inequality that I call leveling the playing field. How about, campaign finance reform, where you try to break the nexus between money and influence. You pass campaign finance reform laws and those sort of things. Or you say, instead of having two tax rules, one for global corporations and the 1%, and another set of tax laws and rules for everybody else, why don't we operate with one set of tax rules? Why do we stop privileging a small segment of taxpayers? So there are things that I think just sort of level the playing field. But here's the problem. We can raise the floor and we can attempt to level the playing field. But as long as the concentration of wealth, as long as there's so much wealth concentrated in few hands, that will continue to undermine anything and everything we try to do. Campaign finance reform, I'm a huge backer of what Lawrence Lessig and others have been talking about. How do we address that? But the problem is, money is like water running down a hill trying to influence politics. You can put up a barrier, you can put up a dam, you can try to dig a hole and keep the money from flowing as fast, but the money is just going to keep flowing into the influence business. And so we actually have to, sort of in tandem, while we're trying to arrest our democracy back from big money, we need to also put forward bold proposals that address the concentration of wealth directly and sort of inch our way forward to push for those changes. So I like to think from like an acupuncturist, what are the pressure points, right? Maybe you've had this experience where your back has gone out and somebody goes and things kind of pop in. There's a lot of things that we need to do, but where are there some particular spots that if we focused our energies and built movements and built a 99% movement, what is it we would push for? And clearly, there's a whole area of what I would call taxing the wealthy. Taxes on the wealthiest 1% have really gone down, not just the last 30 years, but steadily been going down since President Eisenhower, since the 50s. That even under President Kennedy, and really since 1960, since Barack Obama was born in 1961, the share of taxes, the share of the percentage of income of the wealthy has gone steadily, steadily down. It was like in 1960, if you were in the wealthiest 1%, your effective tax rate, what you probably paid in income taxes, was about half of your income. Today it's about 23%. And then the more richer you are and the more your income can be moved offshore or can be considered capital income, the smaller percentage of you pay. So that's how you end up having a Warren Buffett who says, how is it that I pay 14% of my income in taxes and my secretary and my office staff pay 28% of their income in taxes? How could that happen? It's because the rules on taxing the wealthy have been so altered. So we have to reverse that, not just by letting the Bush tax cuts expire, but through a robust inheritance tax, through a new progressive income tax, and the like. So there's a whole bunch of interventions there. They're not popular in Washington, but they're becoming very popular to the wider public. Polls are showing that people now support taxing the wealthy at much progressive levels. 75% of the population, 80% of voters now support that. So we're in a situation now where Washington, the politics of our national society, is completely locked down, or not entirely locked down, but partially locked down. And yet public opinion, the pressure is building for some of these progressive policies. Another set of interventions would actually eliminate the incentive for excessive CEO pay within companies. And every year, the Institute for Policy Studies, we do an annual survey on executive pay, and we look at different aspects of the gap between highest paid workers and average workers in a company. Basically CEOs paid more in a day than their average workers are paid in a year. It sounds like maybe this is symbolic, but actually, if we can address that, and there's a number of rules I won't go and bore you with, but there's a number of ways to address that, we actually get at the root of the incentive system that promotes that short-term, built-to-loot mentality among top managers. And so if we can intervene there, we actually, to require, in a sense, companies to think about longer-term horizons and not just taking the money and run, we actually slow a piece of the machinery that's been generating these inequalities. A third area is to shut down what I call the offshore system, which is the way in which global corporations and the wealthy are able to move their money out of the United States and not just avoid taxation, but avoid accountability in any form. Last year, we did the study. This year, we looked again. There are 25 of the 100 largest companies pay their CEO more than they pay in US taxes. They pay one person more than they pay their entire bill to Uncle Sam. 25 of the 100 biggest companies in the United States. That's because largely they use subsidiaries in Singapore or the Cayman Islands or Luxembourg to move their profits, move their property, move their intellectual property. Apple Computer does this. The big drug companies do it. They pretend that they're shifting their profits offshore and they reduce their tax bill. I used to think this offshore system was kind of an annoying element of our tax system. I used to think, wow, wealthy people move their money to Switzerland, or people have accounts in the Cayman Islands. Now I actually believe that the offshore system is at the center of what's broken. That it's not just about avoiding taxes. AIG, the subsidiary, the insurance company that tanked and brought down, was a contributing factor of the economic meltdown, was a subsidiary based in a secrecy jurisdiction in England. If you care about Africa and poverty in Africa, the offshore system is the way in which corporations and global elites around the world move their money out of countries and extract wealth before it's subject to taxation. And there's a terrific book by a guy named Nicholas Shaxson called Treasure Islands. He's a British journalist. Really interesting if you care about global poverty, tax policy, and corporate accountability. We need to intervene. Well, there's things that can be done. The United States could be a leader in shutting down the offshore system. Barack Obama has actually done a bunch of things that have, at the administrative level, to shut down pieces of the offshore system. But there's now a global movement led by groups like Oxfam, concerned about global poverty, that are exposing. And a new film called We're Not Broke, which premiered at Sundance, that I commend to you to look at how that offshore system works. A couple of other quick intervention areas. We need to break up the mega banks. The 6 big banks that drove our economy off the cliff have their share of the market has increased by like 15% since 2008. These are the banks that would not exist without our taxpayer subsidies. We're subsidizing them to grow and gobble up other banks. So we need to move to prepare for the next time one of these banks starts to wobble. There's not a government bailout, there's a government breakup of those banks. They're not only now too big to fail, they're getting to be too big to save. And so, there's a David Korten has written a terrific paper about sort of how is it that we move from the Wall Street sort of casino economy and these 6 big banks to creating a regional credit system and moving capital back to local institutions. And individuals can do this. There's this whole Move Your Money movement, and religious congregations and municipalities. The city of Boston is debating taking money out of the big mega banks and proactively depositing funds in local and regional banks. The final area that I would point to is the sort of how do we recharter corporations. And we've been working with a task force of members of Congress that are looking at a federal corporate charter where corporations above a certain size and that operate across state borders would be subject to a federal charter. So they can't just be incorporated in Delaware with no accountability, but that they actually have to subscribe to a higher level of transparency. So things like that, a federal charter that redefines corporations, redefines their rights and their disclosure. So those are a couple of examples of interventions that I think would make a difference. On the question of, is it too late? Does Wall Street, does this 1% have so much clout? Are they, when you think about the super PACs and the Citizens United decision that's unleashed even more private money, the Koch brothers now have $13 more billion than they had last year, certainly going to use that to protect the old order and system. What do we do? Where do we go? And I guess that the first thing I would just note is there is actually an awakening. A year ago, I think there was a sense of optimism because there was sort of young people and an Occupy movement, and the whole discussion about inequality burst forward. And then I think there's some sort of disappointment that maybe that didn't lead to, the parallel to sort of a Tea Party politics. But that was never going to be the case. The Occupy movement is what it is, which is a swarm, which is a gathering, which is a convergence. And it did something very useful, which is raise the profile on these inequality issues and the ways in which corporations have captured. Other movements have flowed out of that and will continue to build power. But there's a global awakening on these issues of inequality and concentrated corporate power. The movement to close down offshore tax havens globally is in a very different place than a year ago. The movement for a Wall Street financial transaction tax, a levy on every transaction, is a global movement. The European nations are pressing the United States. Whenever Obama gets together with the leaders of France and Germany, they're all saying, President Obama, why can't you have a Wall Street transaction tax like we're trying to put in place? Why can't we globally move in consort to slow down the speculative frenzy of our financial sectors? So there's a movement building in that area. We're part of an effort called the Other 98%. And I encourage you today to sign up for the Other 98% online and join some of the actions that are coming out of that. Rebuilding the dream. People are forming affinity groups, resilience circles, preparing to think about creative actions to take. So I think there is an awakening. It isn't always mirrored in the mainstream media. And in a way, I think that the Occupy movement might have been a little overhyped, and then all the interesting things that have been underreported. Let us not let that dictate how we understand what's happening in the world. The second piece of good news is there's allies in the 1%. There are countervailing, there's the patriotic millionaires, wealth for the common good. All these networks are forming of people in the 1% who are using their leverage to retell stories about how wealth is created and to advocate for the policies we're talking about here. The third piece of good news is people are not waiting for our political leaders to lead on this issue. They are moving forward wherever there is an opportunity. So the Move to Amend movement to repeal the Citizens United decision is working all over the country at the local level, passing ordinances, doing educational forums, enlisting, Reverend Cecilia Kingman was telling me in Montana, there's statewide pressure to reverse Citizens United. State legislators are debating this. There's sort of a movement that if change is blocked in Washington, we need to move in other arenas. The Move Your Money movement, moving money out of the mega banks. 350.org, the group that's been taking one of the groups nationally that's been working on climate justice and climate change, after the election will be launching a huge campaign to move money out of the fossil fuel sector. Divest yourself, divest your congregation, divest your pension fund from the fossil fuel powerhouses that are blocking reform. So they're not going to Washington to ask for anything. They're taking direct action and doing education along the way. So I think that that's a good sign. And President Obama has campaigned on these issues of inequality. But the reality is he's like getting out in front of the parade because public opinion has already shifted to that spot. And I think that's the good news. But the final thing I would say is that we have working in our favor is that we actually, as individuals and communities, have huge capacity to change, not just in the short term, or not just over years and years, but in the short term. People are making decisions every day to live very differently, to make different choices, and to push for change. And I want to just close with a story, which is a couple months ago now. I was part of a demonstration in Washington, D.C. for a financial transaction tax. Now, how many of you have ever joined a street demonstration in favor of a good tax policy? Raise your hand. Okay. It tends not to get people out into the streets, right? It's not like, it's a little wonky. In fact, a year and a half ago, the number of people who could talk about a financial transaction tax would have fit into this room with you all. This would have been the size of the conversation nationally. But a couple months ago, I was part of a demonstration with 7,000 people marching in the streets of Washington to press for a financial transaction tax, a Wall Street tax. Now, it happened that 6 of the 7,000 people marching were nurses. Are there any nurses in the room? Any nurses? You have a nurse here? Thank you. Okay. It just so happens that the National Nurses Union has decided that the financial transaction tax is like their intervention, the thing that they want to put on the national agenda. And they have thrown their leadership and members and rank and file into this effort. So here I am marching along in Washington with 6,000 nurses. I know because they're all wearing red shirts and the rest of us are not. So I turned and there's one nurse marching along. I said, "Hi, where are you from?" She says, "Oh, I'm from Taunton, Massachusetts." And I said, "Well, I'm from Boston." Taunton, I got people in Taunton. So we start talking. I said, "How did you get here? Or why are you here?" And she says, "Oh, I got off my shift last night at the city hospital and I got on the bus and we came down all overnight and we were sort of partying and laughing and we didn't sleep that much, but here we are. We're out here marching at 9:45 in the morning." And I said, "Wow, that's pretty cool, but why are you here?" And just to understand, Eleanor is probably 55. She's wearing her shirt. Her shirt on the front says, "If you save a life, you are a hero. If you save 100 lives, you're a nurse." And she's holding a placard. In fact, all 6,000 nurses are holding these placards that say, "Heal America, tax Wall Street." And she says, "I am here because I work as an emergency room nurse, and I see the impact of this economy coming in the door on the bodies of my patients. I see people who are overstressed. I see people who have hurt themselves or hurt their loved ones. I see people whose health has been destroyed in the last couple of years by poverty or the collapse of their dreams." She says, "In fact, a couple weeks ago, I was doing an intake. So a man came in with chest pains, probably having a heart attack, and he's sitting on the gurney, and I'm doing his paperwork with him, and I say, 'Sir, Mr. Smith, what's your address?' And he starts to cry, and he says, 'I just lost my house that I've had for 40 years. That's why I'm having these chest pains.' And she looks at me, she says, you hear enough of those stories. You think, yeah, I'm a nurse and I work hard, but I got to do something about this. I got to do something to stop the greed that's destroying our country. I got to protest. I got to get on the bus." And then she looks at me and she says, "Do you know what a financial transaction tax is?" I said, "Yeah, I've heard of it before, but I love hearing about it from you." She says, "Well, this is how it works. You tax Wall Street." She's giving me the rap. And she says, "Now we're going to go meet all 6,000 of us are going to meet with our members of Congress, and we're going to just stay on their butts until they co-sponsor this legislation and pass it. We're just going to be like showing up every month on their doors." So here's the good news. Eleanor got on the bus. And there's a lot of other people who are choosing to say, "Okay, time to answer the call." There are even more people who are waiting for the invitation to come from you, to join you, to get on the bus, or whatever that means for you. So I think the good news is there's an awakening. We may not read about it in the newspaper tomorrow, but I can attest to somebody who gets to travel and talk to groups and see what's going on. There's some rumblings in the land. And I encourage you to be part of that. I'm sure many of you are. Form an affinity group. Get together with some of your neighbors. Talk about the events that we're living through and what you're going to do together. Buck up your spirits. Help out the people who are struggling. Form a mutual aid group or a resilience circle or an affinity group. Don't take action alone. Don't leave this talk and say, "I'm going to go and sign an online petition." Find 5, 10 others. Break bread together. Talk about what to do. Take action together. That's like the missing piece of our movement architecture right now. So let me stop there and invite Rich to come back up, right? Great. Thank you.
how much support in Congress is there actually for a securities transaction tax? And are there any Republicans who have shown any willingness to back such a tax?
So right now the effort is to, actually Peter DeFazio from Oregon has been sort of the lead sponsor and has put forward some of the bills in the past. But I think that there's a growing number of co-sponsors. I think he has like 2 Republican co-sponsors. So you could say it's bipartisan. But it's one of those. So there's both a House bill and a Senate bill. I think both of them are coming, adding momentum, thanks largely to the efforts of the nurses. So it's an important ask at this stage to just ask people to co-sponsor. And then, apparently Obama actually in Ron Susskind's book, The Confidence Men, there's a little section where Obama came into office supporting the idea of a modest financial transaction tax, which the proposal is something like a penny on every $4 of financial transactions, stocks, bonds, derivatives, other exotic financial instruments, would generate $150 to $200 billion a year. So he came in and he was talked out of it by Tim Geithner and Larry Summers, the sort of the representatives of Wall Street in the administration. So there's now, I think, within the administration, some rethinking, hey, maybe this would be good politics. So, and then again, every time he talks to Angela Merkel on the phone, she's saying, come on, Barack, let's get that financial transaction tax, So that's helping as well. So.
Thank you. So this question doesn't speak directly to something you talked about, but it's a question on many people's minds, and I see a lot of young people in the audience here tonight. So I'd like to ask you to address it, Chuck, and that is about student loans. Student loans are crippling the entire next generation. What do you think can and should be done about this?
Well, I think it's a very powerful 99-to-1 issue, right? And it even came up this summer whether to allow student loan interest rates to double or not. And this was a real debate. But I think that if you think about it, there was a generation of students, some of you in this room could probably attest to the fact that you got a debt-free college education thanks to whether it was tied to military service or a Pell Grant or the like, that the percentage of debt that students are taking on is enormous. And I don't know if any of you have children or both individually, personally in college, or have children or grandchildren who are trying to figure out how to pay for college, but it's a whole new world, right? It's a whole new world than it was 30 years ago. Part of that is that the college and university system there's very little cost control systems within those institutions. There's, the price of tuition has risen dramatically in relation to the other costs of living. So there has to be some efforts within higher education to control costs, just like in healthcare. You have to create some breaks. There has to be, then I think, there has to be a movement to push for debt-free or low-cost college educations. I mean, one of the proposals I think we should pass is something like you have a robust inheritance tax in this country, like what Bill Gates and I have been advocating for, that goes, raises, X billions of dollars, that goes into a higher education trust fund where students can get access to debt-free college educations in exchange for 2 years of national service. You do 2 years of military or civilian national service, you get a debt-free college education. Well, there's a lot going on there. You're addressing the concentration of wealth, you're reducing this huge burden, crippling burden on young people, and you're reweaving the social fabric by creating a national service that sort of links together and has people experience across communities and across class some of the benefits of being active in our society. So those are the kind of interventions that I would advocate. But I think that there's another question, which is what is higher education for? What is college education for? It's a bigger discussion, an interesting thing to think about in the context of where we're going in terms of a new economy. are, as somebody, we have, in our family, young people in college or wanting to go to college, and the discussion always is like, what are you going to get for this? Are you being prepared for anything relational to the new economy? We've said to our kids, we'll give you $10,000 to go to trade school. Learn how to be an engineer, a plumber, build small hydro, whatever. Well, you want to be a farmer? Take that money, we'll help you buy some land. Learn the skills and trades of the new economy, not go into debt to learn something tied to the old economy. So I think there's a larger debate over how should we be directing higher education, and for what occupation should we be encouraging young people to go forward into?
Thanks. So this is another question that speaks directly to one of the solutions you were talking about. Given the obsolescence of the nation state caused by transnational globalization, how can the offshore economy that you talk about really practically be shut down?
Well, we have lived in a global economy for centuries. What's changed is the movement of capital has really accelerated. The ability to move capital across borders without, electronically, has accelerated the global movement of money. But it's really in the last 15 years that the offshore system has moved to this current level of, it's like every corporation's got to do it. It's sort of like, and there are things that can be done. One is through treaties. The United States can use its economic clout. This is one of the places where we are a superpower, right? You can say, look, we can take the lead in corporate disclosure, disclosure across. You can say, if you want to do business in the United States, you need to disclose all the jurisdictions where you pay taxes. Country by country reporting is the name of the reform. You can basically outlaw creating subsidiaries for the sole purpose of tax avoidance. You can do that with individuals. You cannot move money offshore solely for the purpose of tax avoidance. There has to be a real business. It's one thing if your company actually has subsidiaries that do business in other countries. It's another thing when you just have a post office box in the Cayman Islands of a corporation that holds your patents. So you can outlaw, Congress can outlaw certain types of corporations that are existing for the purpose of avoiding and dodging taxes. So, and the United States can use its global clout to enforce treaties. You want to trade with the United States? You want to sell products? Then you have to meet this global set of standards. So the United States can play a progressive role in that. So I think those are a couple of the ways. And there is Senator Carl Levin in the Senate has been the champion on this issue for Michigan. The Senator Carl Levin should look at his Stop Tax Haven Abuse legislation and some of the current legislation he's putting forward that actually, it's fairly complicated, but there's like 17 different interventions that actually would make a huge difference in shutting down the offshore system and really the secrecy jurisdictions that exist. There's 65 countries that are now officially secrecy jurisdictions. And if they want to do business with the United States, they have to become more transparent. That would really change the dynamic.
Thanks. So there were 3 or 4 questions that I'm going to collapse into one because they're all a very similar theme, which is that when you talk about distribution of wealth and shared prosperity, it conjures up images of communism and socialism. You never use that terminology. But is what you're talking about not some form of communist or socialist wealth redistribution?
Well, in the current phase of extreme inequality of wealth and income, I've talked to business people where I've said, if you care about capitalism, whatever that means to you, you need to be very concerned about these this maldistribution of wealth, because this is distorting the capitalism that you profess to believe in. It's creating monopolies and distortions and power concentrations that are warping and destroying capitalism. If you care about small business in this country, then why is it a small business has to compete on an unlevel playing field with these global corporations that have an entirely different set of rules? That is wrecking healthy capitalism. From there, I think we could say, look, part of the problem is we are destroying nature and squeezing people in an exploitative way, that our current form of capitalism is destroying nature and creating these grotesque inequalities and perpetuating poverty. That there are other forms of capitalism, the Scandinavian model or other forms of capitalism, where they have a vibrant private market that has private enterprises and flourishing small businesses, and that is a good thing. And there's huge amounts of the economy that are tied down. For instance, the ecological commons is protected and managed for the long-term, survival of a community and the planet. That you can't get rich. The built-to-loot model of capitalism has to be shut down. What happens after that is where lots of people can have different theories and divergence. But I'd like to see an economy that has a healthy private sector, but that doesn't have these grotesque extreme inequalities, and that where certain things are socialized or community owned. Certain kinds of natural resources should be community owned or nationally owned. Certain parts of the commons, if you will, should not be up for grabs for looting. For instance, if we create knowledge through public investments, that knowledge should be commons. It should not be enclosed and taken from us and sold back. Google should not Xerox every book and then sell them back to us. Seeds should not be owned by, patents on seeds should not be owned by multinational companies. They should be held in the commons. Yoga postures should not be owned by somebody. They belong to all of us. So there's a way in which protecting the commons, the economic and social commons and the infrastructure and knowledge commons, if that's protected, we have a society. I don't know what to call it. It's not capitalism as it's currently, but it's not socialism. It's not state ownership of the means of production. There's Gar Alperovitz, who's a terrific thinker, has what he calls kind of a pluralist commonwealth. Municipal ownership, nonprofit ownership, state ownership, federal ownership. The more sort of centralized and national owned, the worse it's going to be. I mean, the more you can decentralize ownership, the better. So, I'm sorry for this rambling answer, but I think that basically we should, before we kind of get into a debate about socialism versus capitalism, I would just like to say, look, if you care about capitalism, we've got to reduce these extreme inequalities. If you care about the future of the earth and our communities, we've got to protect the commonwealth and the commons from looting. We've got to shut down the built-to-loot elements of capitalism.
So as a follow-on, one of the things that you talk most about in terms of redistribution is around taxing the wealthy, and you cite in your book about how there are many people among the 1% even who would be willing to pay more taxes. But there's a number of those folks who would be willing to pay more taxes to recycle opportunity, as you say, but that resist the idea of actually paying more taxes when so much of their tax dollars are going to go to service the national debt and to pay for defense spending. How do you respond to that?
Yeah, taxes are the price you pay to live in a civilized society. The wealthy should not get to opt out of paying for whatever it is that Congress appropriates money for. Everybody else is having money taken out of their paychecks to pay the bills, whatever. There's a fight, a struggle over what are the uses of our tax dollars. yes, the military, I have my plan. Other people have their plan. We have to duke that out in a democratic society as to what the priorities are. Then there's the question of what's the system through which we pay. And there are a lot of people I know who are in the 1%. I mean, we've encountered this question in our networks, Wealth for the Common Good, saying, I would pay more taxes if I could check a box off and have it go to where I want. That's not how democratic societies work. You're going to have to get in there and fight for your fixing the national priorities just like everybody else. In the meantime, you don't get to opt out. Taxation is different than charity. Charity does very useful things, but it is not a substitute for infrastructure and for the other uses of tax dollars. So I guess my argument is there's a one set of political debates over how we use our money, but the system of revenue should be a progressive system, and we should move as quickly as possible to move toward that.
How do you think we combat the anti-government sentiment that is so pervasive among the 99% who will actually often vote against their own economic interests?
I think that there's a rock-solid segment of society that is just anti-government, that for whatever reason they look at the world through a lens of the government as a source of the problem. It's probably like 25% of the electorate. It's what animates the Tea Party. Then there's a huge amount of what I would call a contested part of the population who have a number of different windows or lenses that they look at society through. One is government is incompetent. And we all can think of examples where government waste or government, in my state, we still pay state police officers, double pay to do detail on work projects, construction projects, like on my dead-end street. There'll be a state police officer because there's a backhoe fixing there's like no cars, right? We're going to pay time. So people all can think of things that irritate them about that. But the other reality is if you want to address the concentration of corporate power, if you want to have a society that is good public health and infrastructure and the like, and most people believe both things. They believe government's both incompetent and they want a robust government to intervene to solve some of these problems. So part of it, I think the challenge is government has, there's been a 30, 40-year anti-government public relations campaign that's been waged. It's systematic and it's part of a strategy to weaken government, weaken the regulatory power of government, and shift and privatize more and more of the wealth in this country. So there's an anti-government campaign. We have to sort of come back and say, yes, there's things that we need to do. We need to reinvent government. We need to create greater accountability. We need to strengthen democracy to hold government accountable. But a vibrant, functioning local government is absolutely essential to a good society. And the good news is that more and more people are starting, after the economic meltdown, some of that I don't like government went away because government started to have an impact. In my part of the country, the state of Vermont, I have a little cabin in the state of Vermont. A year ago, Hurricane Irene came through and dropped, dozens of inches of rain on southern Vermont, washed away our infrastructure, bridges. Basically, it's taken a year to rebuild. But there are heroic stories of individuals, communities, and state government doing amazing things to move and restore the infrastructure in the state. You're not going to find that, whatever hardcore anti-government sentiment starts to shake and rattle when real needs emerge. And I think that's where we need to sort of continue to make the compelling case for a engaged activist government that helps underscore a good society.
One of the tax policies, someone asked a question about some tax ideas that you actually didn't talk about, and that is, should one of the policies to pursue be a value-added and/or a gasoline tax? Because A, they're less susceptible to gaming the system through legislation, and B, tax avoidance. What do you think about that?
Yeah, thank you for asking that question, because I think, although I don't think that those taxes address the concentration of wealth and power, although you could have a progressive consumption tax or a progressive value-added tax that taxes certain types of consumption at higher levels, I think that's key to the transition from the old economy, the dinosaur fossil fuel economy, to a new economy, is taxing the new bads. So we have a tax system now built that taxes income, that taxes some savings, and that has the sin taxes of, cigarettes and consumption taxes of various kinds, which are very regressive. If we want to help pave the way to a new economy, we should tax pollution, speculation, and concentrated wealth at higher levels. If we do that, then we start to really, a key intervention. I mean, if I had my 3 things that I could get by waving the wand, I would want to see a carbon tax phased in over 5 years that totally changes the cost of it. It signals to the market all kinds of investments. It would create huge drive to create all kinds of new energy efficient technologies and building practices. That would make a huge difference. Similarly, taxing speculation, financial transactions, starts to generate revenue from an antisocial activity that's actually hurting the economy. So taxing the new bads is taxing pollution, taxing carbon, taxing other kinds of pollutants and gases that enter our system, raising the cost, and forcing all of us to create new practices and new systems to reshuffle that. So I think a value-added tax that taxes certain kinds of consumption would help move us in that way. Thank you for that comment.
Can you talk a little bit about how you think that immigration and immigration reform affect inequality in this country?
It's an interesting question. In the 70s and 80s and 90s, immigration did have, people don't like to talk about this, it did have an effect on the wage structure. It was a contributing factor to one of the ways in which wages at the bottom fifth pulled down, because competition at the floor. But if you create a path to citizenship, if you create protections for immigrant workers, then you can't pit workers against each other in the race to the bottom of who will work for less. And you don't have this exploited sector of wage workers. So on one level, and that's an important part of the picture, the protections for immigrant workers do help raise standards and raise wages. I think that politically, immigration and the focus on new immigration has been one of the ways in which people have been, the 99% has been divided and distracted and pitted against each other in a way that's allowed for all these other regressive policies to work. So as some of my immigrant rights leaders friends say, when the white working class is being told to focus on immigrants as the source of their problems, they better hold on to their wallets because somebody's trying to pick their pocket. That the politics of deflection and resentment is part of that. Otherwise, I think that there is a set of other human rights issues that is slightly aside from the sort of economic inequality issues that we're talking about. There's just the dignity and rights and having a sane immigration policy on the side.
Thanks. You talked tonight, Chuck, about the inequality scorecard that you're going to be releasing on Monday that ranks legislation according to whether it benefits the 1 or the 99%. Along those lines, someone asked a question, are you going to put out a list with CEOs and their salaries of the built-to-loot corporations?
Every Labor Day we do the CEO pay report where we look at the companies that don't pay taxes, pay their CEOs excessively, actually have the kind of wrong incentive, the built-to-loot incentive systems. So, and an easy way to find it is at inequality.org. So that's a sort of a portal that we've created that has data, analysis, commentary. That's kind of easy to remember, right? Inequality.org. So if you go there right now, you'll see our most recent CEO pay study that looks at, we look at the top 300 companies and which ones sort of have the most reckless short-term outlook practices. And that's where this week you'll find our inequality scorecard too. That'll be coming out. So inequality.org is kind of the home for that.
Thanks. I just got the wink from Rich Lang. So we're going to wind down here with maybe two more questions, both of which are more kind of future looking. The first is kind of a worst case scenario, Chuck. If Romney becomes the next president and times get very dire, this person writes, I fear that people will not work in solidarity, but will take their fears, anguish, and desperation out on each other. Do you think that's an irrational fear, or do you share that?
I think that there are some kind of gloomy scenarios out there. You probably have your own, right? So, but I think there is a scenario where you get a kind of a Romney president, or even a kind of Barack Obama presidency in a climate where the climate there hasn't been any kind of shift in the political dynamic, and we continue to polarize in the way that we are, but we also go through some tough times together. We have another economic meltdown. We have a series of ecological, extreme weather events that sort of hit the economy. We have other sort of trip points or scenarios. Then you have a situation where people either pull back and you have a politics of fear and you sort of have a fortress walled response, or you have, sort of a coming together community response. And the reality is you probably have both. You probably have both in any kind of stress situation. You have a Cascadia Fault earthquake, or you have a New York City gets hit by a hurricane, the financial center, there's disruptions there. So or you have, Greece and then Spain, and then there's a sort of economic tripwire that hits the United States. And, none of the fundamentals of the economic system have been fixed since 2008. Wall Street has done a good job blocking meaningful reform. The one thing I would say is that so what do we do in that? Well, I think realize that there are going to be these stresses. There are going to be these pressures on our community, regardless of who's the president. We're going to have to face a set of challenges that we are ill-prepared for. So we need to prepare for them. We need to do preparedness work in our communities, which is having reality-based conversations about what's happening. What are the future scenarios? Let's talk about the different scenarios going forward over the next 5 or 10 years. Bill McKibben has a terrific article out in Rolling Stone, The New Math of Climate Change. And you all should read it, but don't read it alone. Find a group of people and read it together and talk about what does it mean. That's where I come back to form your small group, form your affinity group, or your resilience circle. Go to localcircles.org and get the kit on how do you organize a sort of resilience circle. And that preparedness, the more we're prepared, the more we've had these conversations in advance, and the more we've put some of those support systems in place, the less people will move toward fear, and the more there will be people saying, here's the community response. And one other thing, we have untapped capacity to respond in a community way. Rebecca Solnit has this terrific book, Paradise Built in Hell, where she looks at California earthquake, she looks at a number of sort of disasters that have hit the United States and the human spirit that is unleashed, the ability of people to be helpful and respond in a mutual way as opposed to a fear-based, selfish way. And that we can go either way as individuals and as communities. So the more we're prepared and the more we, not in a fearful way even, it doesn't even have to be in a kind of apocalypse way. In fact, I would say that doesn't help at all. I would actually say we're in for some change. It actually is a huge opportunity to reorganize our communities and our society to be more the way we want to be and the more our nature is. And so to welcome some of the change, but the better prepared we are, the more resilient we are individually and as communities, the more that transition will be a positive experience, not a fear-based response.
Thanks, Chuck. The final question, you talked about a lot of different ideas, solutions, policies, suggestions, and someone asked this question: how coordinated does all of this need to be? Leveling the field, raising the floor, changing policies. Is it sufficient that we're all doing different things, using different approaches, or is there really a need for more of a centralized strategy?
That's a good question. I don't have an answer to that. I think that a lot of it can happen without any kind of central coordination. I think that there's no substitute for leadership, national, regional, community leadership to help sort of focus attention. I imagine, having looked at the history of sort of how social change has happened in other places, it sort of happens in patchwork ways, but that at certain moments there are leaders and there are kind of campaigns, or there are sort of demands that sort of merge together, and there's a coalescing around it. I see that happening around the response to fossil fuel, the power of the fossil fuel industry right now. That there's sort of you can sort of sense certain convergences happening. And they're not necessarily happening in a coordinated national organization way, but they're happening in a kind of a more organic way. But at some point, leaders will emerge, probably some of them from this room, that will help us focus at particular moments in history on what needs to happen. So yes, things look fragmented and not always coordinated, but and I think there are national leaders like Van Jones and the Rebuild the Dream movement. Sure, I'll follow that. Lead on. So I think we have to learn how to be generous followers, even when everything isn't perfect, to say, I'll follow that, and I will put my heart and soul into that. So I think that welcoming the new generation of leaders as they emerge and learn how to be good followers at times will be part of how that coordination happens.
Thank you. And I want to also say that what an honor it's been to have one of those national leaders in the room with us, sharing his insights tonight. So thank you. And
thank you.
The very last yellow card I will read here was not a question, but a comment to Chuck, which is, thank you, Chuck Collins. Keep on keeping on. Thank you, everyone.